Welcome back to our third episode, From Opinion to Insight, where we once again dive into the past to find answers for today's questions. Today, we're embarking on a sweeping journey through centuries of global transformation, uncovering how pivotal moments in history still shape the world we live in right now.
It really is fascinating, isn't it? Exploring how seemingly distant events, the age of discovery, empires rising and falling, these vast trade networks, how they're all intricately linked to things we talk about today, things like global power, economic disparities, even historical responsibility.
Absolutely. Our mission is to unpack this long chain of events, starting way back in the late Middle Ages. We want to reveal how all these different perspectives and this whole tapestry of motivations led to such profound, often irreversible changes across continents.
We'll trace the rise of the Ottoman Empire, the European search for new trade routes. Then we'll explore that dramatic collision of continents, the really devastating transatlantic slave trade, and later the scramble for Africa.
And this isn't just about reciting historical facts, is it? It's more about uncovering those surprising connections and really understanding how decisions made centuries ago continue to shape the world you live in today. Our journey starts in the late Middle Ages. What was happening around 1453 that really ignited Europe's drive to explore the unknown? What was the catalyst?
The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire in 1453 was absolutely a monumental turning point, a really big shift. The city, renamed Istanbul pretty quickly, became the new center of this incredibly powerful empire. By the 16th century, under sultans like Suleiman the Great, they controlled huge territories across Europe, Asia, and Africa.
And that wasn't just a political thing, right? It had a direct impact on something as, everyday as what Europeans could buy, even what ended up on their tables.
Precisely. The Ottomans now controlled key land trade routes. Think about the Silk Road, or parts of it anyway. These were the arteries for luxury goods: pepper, silk, porcelain, cinnamon coming from China and India into Europe. By slapping on hefty tolls and sometimes even closing routes entirely, they drove the prices of these Eastern goods way, way up. This economic pressure wasn't just like an inconvenience. It became a primary, undeniable driver for European traders and monarchs to actively seek alternative routes, sea routes to Asia, basically bypassing Ottoman control.
Okay, so the economics are clear. But it wasn't just about the money, was it? There had to be other motivations pushing these, incredibly ambitious voyages.
Oh, absolutely. The motives were incredibly complex, really intertwined. Economic, yes, but also political and cultural, religious, too. European kings, for instance, they weren't just seeking wealth, they were chasing increased power, national prestige, And there was also this very strong religious impulse, spreading Christianity, often through missionaries, which some saw as a kind of strategic response to the growing influence of the Islamic world, even if perhaps some European ideas about Muslim rulers were, often exaggerated, but it definitely shaped how Europeans saw things.
And I'm hearing the Renaissance played a role too. Not just art and culture, but like science and just intellectual curiosity kicking in. How did that broader cultural shift feed into this?
Yes. The Renaissance sparked this profound, renewed interest in science, discovery, classical knowledge. You had scholars fleeing Constantinople after its fall, bringing ancient texts to Europe. And the significantly advanced knowledge in fields like astronomy, cartography, navigation, these weren't just academic things. They were absolutely essential skills for undertaking such ambitious voyages across vast, unknown oceans.
So with all these driving forces, money, power, religion, new knowledge, who were the first to truly venture out?
The Portuguese.
Yeah.
They were definitely the initial trailblazers. Think about Bartolomeu Dias. He successfully rounded the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, in 1488. That single act proved a viable sea route to Asia existed. It was possible.
A huge breakthrough.
And then, just a decade later, 1498, Vasco da Gama actually reached the west coast of India using that route. This meant direct trade. No Ottoman middlemen. A huge economic and strategic win for Portugal.
Right.
This wasn't just discovery. It was a monumental economic and strategic victory. changed everything.
So Portugal heads east. But then the Spanish took a different path, didn't they? A world-altering one.
They sought a western route to Asia. So in 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail. He was convinced, utterly convinced, he'd reach the east. But instead, he lands in the Bahamas, part of what we now know as the Americas. This accidental discovery, well, it initiated the profound European colonization of this new world.
We often romanticize these explorers, don't we? These great figures. But what was the day-to-day reality like for a sailor back then in the 15th or 16th century? It sounds brutal.
Oh, it was incredibly grim. Forget the romance. Imagine ships that were small, unbelievably cramped, and often just disgusting. Unsanitary. Food was scarce, often spoiled, and the dangers. Constant. Violent storms, diseases like scurvy wiping people out, even mutinies were a real threat.
Wow.
Yet despite all of that, the alluring promise of immense wealth, or maybe just adventure, finding something new, it still convinced countless people to sign up for these perilous expeditions.
Okay, let's pivot to the Americas. Columbus's arrival in 1492. It marks the start of radical, often devastating changes. As the Spanish conquistadors pushed inland, what happened next?
Well, you saw a rapid series of, frankly, brutal conquests. Hernan Cortez, with only a few hundred soldiers, but aided by indigenous rivals of the Aztecs, managed to conquer the incredibly powerful Aztec Empire. He took their capital in 1521. And similarly, Francisco Pizarro captured and executed the Inca leader Atahualpa. That led to the fall of the Inca capital, Cusco, in 1533. Swift and brutal.
And beyond the military force, the diseases the Europeans brought. They had an unimaginable impact, right? I mean, what happens when these two worlds, isolated for thousands of years, suddenly collide?
That's such a crucial question, and the answer is devastating. Diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza, things indigenous populations had absolutely no immunity to. They caused catastrophic demographic decline. We're talking about the death of millions, leading to the tragic loss of entire centuries-old civilizations, their knowledge, their cultures, gone.
Unthinkable.
And on top of that biological catastrophe, the Spanish imposed their language, their culture, their Christianity, often violently destroying sacred sites, forcibly converting populations. It was a cultural invasion just as devastating as the physical one. And it led to the irreversible loss of ancient civilizations, their knowledge, their ways of life.
But it wasn't purely a one-way street of destruction, was it? I mean, there was also this massive exchange happening between the continents, even if it was incredibly uneven.
Yes, if we connect this to the bigger picture, that's the Columbian exchange. And it was monumental, a huge two-way transfer. Plants, animals, people, and crucially diseases, moving between the Old World, Europe, Africa, Asia, and the New World, the Americas.
No, what kind of things moved?
Well, from Europe came animals like horses, cows, pigs, sheep, crops like wheat. And from the Americas, the world gained things we now take for granted. Maize, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, chocolate. These absolutely revolutionized European agriculture and diets. I mean, can you imagine Italian food without tomatoes?
Hard to picture. And you mentioned the exchange of people. That leads us directly, doesn't it, to one of history's most horrific chapters, the transatlantic slave trade.
Tragically, yes. And what's deeply sobering here is how economic demand, particularly for these new American cash crops, drove such immense human suffering. The colonization of the Americas led to these vast plantations: sugar, tobacco, cotton, all highly sought after in Europe, all for export. As the indigenous populations were plummeting, mostly from disease but also from brutal exploitation, the European colonists turned to Africa. Forced labor initiating the brutal triangle trade. This wasn't some natural consequence. It actively laid the groundwork for an unprecedented system of global inequality. It fueled wealth in one part of the world at an unimaginable human cost in others.
Can you walk us through the mechanics of that triangle?
Yeah.
And more importantly, the profound human cost. It's hard to even comprehend.
It is. Basically, European ships sailed to Africa. They were laden with manufactured goods, textiles, rum, guns. They exchanged these goods for enslaved people, often captured in wars fueled by the demand for slaves, or acquired using those very weapons or alcohol.
A vicious cycle.
Absolutely. Then these enslaved individuals were packed into horrific, inhumane conditions onto ships for the journey across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage. It was a living hell. Countless numbers died from illness, starvation, suffocation, or just sheer violence and despair. If they survived that, they faced a life of relentless forced labor on plantations or in mines, no pay, severe punishments, the constant threat of violence, and the profound, enduring loss of freedom, culture, family, everything. Many were held in slave forts first, like Elmina Castle in Ghana, waiting in terror before the voyage even began.
Looking back, it's just staggering. How did Europeans even begin to morally justify this level of extreme exploitation? And what was the bigger global picture, the impact of this new, deeply unequal interconnectedness?
Well, the justification often rested on ethnocentrism, this deeply ingrained belief that one's own culture is inherently superior. Europeans frequently viewed Africans and indigenous Americans as uncivilized, savage, and they saw themselves in a really twisted way as bringers of civilization or Christianity.
A convenient narrative.
Extremely convenient. It served to legitimize the immense profits slavery generated. And it's crucial to understand, those profits significantly contributed to the foundations of modern capitalism and the economic boom in Europe. This new globalized economy, linking Europe, Africa, America, Asia for the first time. It was fundamentally unequal from the start. Europe grew vastly richer and more powerful. Africa suffered terrible depopulation, exploitation, the tearing apart of societies.
How did other major powers at the time, like say Ming China or the Ottoman Empire, how did they deal with this period of intense European expansion?
Yeah, their experiences were quite different from what happened in the Americas, much different. In China, for instance, you had Jesuit missionaries arriving. They introduced some European science, but largely they had to adapt to Chinese culture, to Confucianism. The Chinese emperors maintained pretty strong control. They largely kept widespread European political influence at bay during this period.
And the Ottomans.
The Ottoman Empire remained a really formidable world power. European nations generally had to negotiate with them, treaties, trade agreements. It wasn't a case of outright conquest like in the Americas. Africa, of course, suffered immensely from the slave trade depopulation, violence, economic disruption. But even there, responses varied. Some African kings and traders cooperated with the Europeans sadly, while many others fiercely resisted.
So how do we see the echoes of this past, this unequal beginning, in our world today?
Oh, the echoes are loud. This past isn't just past, it actively lives on. The legacy of slavery, for instance, manifests in ongoing issues of systemic racism, deeply entrenched poverty, structural inequalities that persist right now. Recognizing this history, understanding the deep roots of these disparities, it's absolutely crucial. Because this history continues to shape our present realities. It influences everything from, museum exhibits and what's taught in schools to really passionate debates over public monuments and national memory.
Okay, we've covered that first wave of colonization, largely focused on the Americas. Let's fast forward now to the 19th century. This period is often called the Scramble, particularly for Africa. Where did the focus move then, and what were the new drivers behind this modern imperialism?
Right, so while early modern colonization was heavily focused on the Americas and maybe coastal areas of Africa and Asia, the 19th century saw this furious rush to conquer the interiors of Africa and huge parts of Asia. A major catalyst was the Industrial Revolution back in Europe, demand for new raw materials, copper, rubber, oil, and just as important, they needed new markets to sell all the manufactured goods those factories were producing. France, maybe a bit less industrialized initially, tried to catch up by extracting resources from places like Indochina and large parts of West Africa.
And it wasn't just about economics anymore, was it? This idea of national prestige and that sort of civilizing mission seemed to really take hold.
Absolutely. Politically, having a large colonial empire became the ultimate symbol of national power and prestige. Great Britain famously aimed for an empire where the sun never sets. They envisioned this belt of colonies stretching from Cape Town all the way to Cairo. And culturally, yes, that belief in European racial and cultural superiority led to paternalism. This idea that Europeans had a duty, a burden almost, to care for and uplift so-called less developed peoples. This often meant intense missionary work, aggressive attempts at assimilation forcing people to adopt European languages, religions, cultures, though sometimes they used indirect rule too, working through local leaders. Some countries even saw colonization as a kind of social safety valve, a place to send unemployed people or, problem youth.
A really striking example of this 19th century dynamic played out in China with the Opium Wars. That seems like a clear case of this new imperial aggression. What was the core issue there?
Yeah, the Opium Wars are a stark example. Basically, British traders were illegally flooding China with opium, grown often in British India. They did this to balance their trade deficit because Britain wanted lots of Chinese goods, tea, silk, porcelain, but China didn't want much from Britain. Opium became the grim solution for Britain.
So Britain was essentially drug trafficking on a massive scale.
That's one way to put it. When the Chinese government finally tried to crack down and halt this devastating illicit trade, it triggered the First Opium War, 1839 to 1842. China was defeated, leading to the humiliating Treaty of Nanking. Then came a Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, with France joining Britain. This further weakened China, opened up even more areas, and imposed extraterritoriality.
Extraterritoriality, what's that?
It meant that Europeans in China were subject to their own country's laws, not Chinese law.
Understandably, that must have caused massive resentment. How did the Chinese people react?
Huge resentment, exactly. It eventually boiled over into the Boxer Rebellion, around 1899-1900, a secret society. The righteous fists of harmony, the West called them Boxers, rose up. They attacked foreigners, missionaries, and Chinese Christians who they saw as collaborators. In response, 8 Western nations, plus Japan and the U.S., sent a joint military force in 1900. They brutally suppressed the uprising, which further weakened the imperial Chinese government and deepened foreign control.
So while China was resisting, fiercely but ultimately unsuccessfully at that time, Africa was facing a different kind of onslaught, the Scramble for Africa. That phrase itself is chilling.
It is. Starting mainly from the 1870s, European powers engaged in this frantic, almost chaotic race to claim African territories. It was incredibly competitive. This intense competition actually led them to hold the Berlin Conference in 1884-1885. European leaders gathered in Berlin, and they literally sat around a table and formally partitioned almost the entire continent of Africa amongst themselves, with absolutely no African representation present. None.
Just carved it up.
Just carved it up. The official aims stated were things like preserving peace between European powers and promoting free trade. But the reality, it was about securing raw materials, strategic locations, power, and resources for themselves. A key outcome was this thing called the principle of effective occupation. Basically, you couldn't just plant a flag. You had to show you had administrators or troops on the ground to claim a territory. This just accelerated the pace of colonization even faster.
And within this scramble, one of those horrifying chapters has to be King Leopold II's personal rule over the Congo. It stands out even in an era of brutality.
It really does. Leopold II of Belgium managed, through some very clever maneuvering and PR, to acquire the vast Congo basin as his personal possession. Not Belgium's colony, his. He called it the Congo Free State, État Indépendant du Congo. He used a private organization, the AIC, presenting it as this great humanitarian and scientific venture to fight slavery and bring progress.
But the reality was?
The reality was the complete opposite. It was a regime of extreme, systematic, violent exploitation. The main goal was extracting rubber and ivory. Congolese people were forced into labor, given impossible quotas for collecting rubber. If they failed to meet them, they faced horrifying punishments. Hands or feet chopped off, floggings, village burnings, murder. Entire communities were devastated. Millions, literally millions, are estimated to have perished from exhaustion, starvation, disease, or direct violence under his rule.
How did it finally end?
Eventually, international outrage grew too strong to ignore. Courageous individuals like the British journalist E.D. Morel and the diplomat Roger Casement meticulously documented and exposed the atrocities.
Sure.
Immense public pressure, both within Belgium and internationally, finally compelled Leopold II to relinquish his personal control. He ceded the Congo to the Belgian state in 1908. It became the Belgian Congo, but the legacy of that brutality lingered.
So looking back at all of this, the arbitrary borders drawn across continents, the relentless resource extraction, the cultural imposition, how do these historical actions still ripple through our world today? What are the lasting legacies?
The consequences are profound and, frankly, still unfolding. They continue to be a major source of tension, instability, and conflict in many parts of Africa and Asia today.
Still causing problems now?
Absolutely. Colonization also meant widespread loss of land, loss of freedom, loss of culture. European languages, religions, legal systems were imposed, often erasing or marginalizing indigenous ones. Economically, colonies were fundamentally restructured. They became suppliers of raw materials for Europe and captive markets for European goods, often forced to grow cash crops like cotton or cocoa for export instead of food for themselves. This contributed to famines and created long-term economic dependency, patterns that are hard to break.
So European wealth grew on the back of this system.
Significantly. European wealth and industrial growth were substantially built on the exploitation of colonial resources and labor. That's undeniable. And even though decolonization movements successfully gained independence for many nations, especially after World War II, the colonial past continues to manifest. You see it in persistent issues of poverty, systemic racism, vast inequalities in global power and wealth. The structures built during colonialism didn't just vanish with independence.
Which brings us to a really crucial and often quite uncomfortable question for today. How do we reckon with this past? Are countries like Britain, France, Belgium responsible for the colonization carried out by their ancestors? How do philosophers help us think through this complex tangle of historical responsibility?
It's a huge question, and philosophy offers various ways to approach it, not necessarily easy answers. Thinkers like Immanuel Kant, back in the Enlightenment, argued for the fundamental dignity of every human being. People should never be treated merely as a means to an end. That principle fundamentally challenges the entire basis of colonial exploitation, where people were treated as means to European ends.
What about philosophers who directly challenge that notion of European cultural superiority that seemed to underpin so much of it?
Well, you had Montesquieu, for instance. He championed cultural relativism, arguing that laws and customs should be adapted to the specific context of the climate. That directly counters the colonial idea that European ways are universally superior and should be imposed everywhere. Much later, in the 20th century, Michel Foucault offered a powerful analysis. He looked at how Western power wasn't just about force, but also about knowledge and discourse. How it presented its domination as rational, scientific, civilized, when it was fundamentally about control, what he called disciplinary power, shaping and suppressing people under the guise of improvement or progress.
That's fascinating. What about the utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mill? Their goal was the greatest good for the greatest number. How does that fit?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, even that philosophy, which sounds quite reasonable, maximizing overall well-being, was sometimes twisted to justify empire. John Stuart Mill, who actually worked for the British East India Company, defended British rule in India. He argued it brought progress, order, and was ultimately for the greatest good, even if it involved overriding Indian self-rule.
So the definition of good was imposed.
Exactly. It shows how even seemingly benevolent principles could be manipulated to rationalize exploitation and oppression, all under the banner of civilization and bringing benefits.
And what about contemporary thinkers? How do they suggest we move forward, acknowledging this past?
Contemporary thought often emphasizes action and justice. Martha Nussbaum, for example, with her capability approach, argues that society should be judged by the real opportunities, the capabilities they give people to lead full, flourishing lives. Nussbaum argues that simply saying, "oh, that was the past," isn't enough. Active solidarity and striving for global justice are required now to address the ongoing effects.
Collective responsibility, not necessarily personal guilt, like Paul Ricoeur suggested.
Exactly. Ricoeur draws that vital distinction. Individual guilt belongs to the perpetrators, but collective responsibility falls on the societies that inherit the legacies of those actions. It means societies have a duty to acknowledge their past, even the uncomfortable parts, even acts committed by ancestors. And this responsibility requires us to actively confront and address the ongoing impacts, the inequalities, the traumas. It requires what Ricoeur called moral imagination, the ability to truly try and empathize with the victims, past and present.
And it's interesting, even ancient philosophical traditions had things to say that seem relevant.
Absolutely. Thinkers like Augustinus, St. Augustine, called for humility, for focusing on inner spiritual reform, which implicitly argues against the arrogance needed to dominate others. And someone like Averroes, the influential Islamic philosopher from Cordoba, he championed reason and the value of dialogue between cultures. His whole approach strongly countered any notion that one culture held a monopoly on truth or superiority. He advocated for learning from each other.
So this isn't just some abstract philosophical debate confined to university seminar rooms. We see these historical legacies, these debates about responsibility, playing out very publicly, right? In our news, in our cities.
Absolutely. It's happening all around us. Look at the ongoing discussions and actions around historical monuments. Think about the removal of Christopher Columbus's statue in Mexico City, replaced with a monument honoring indigenous women. Or the debates around the Columbus statue in Barcelona, where the city decided not to remove it, but instead emphasizes educational tours to explain its complex, contested history.
So, grappling with the symbols.
Yes, societies are actively grappling with how they represent their past and whose stories get told. And beyond symbols, connected to current events. Think about, say, China's extensive involvement today in extracting raw materials like cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo. You can see echoes, can't you? Historical patterns of resource extraction, global power imbalances rooted way back in the colonial past, they continue to shape international relations and economic realities right now. It's not ancient history.
That's a really powerful point. Thinking about everything we've discussed, from the initial voyages to the lasting impacts, from the Ottoman Empire's control of trade routes, sparking that initial push for exploration, to the incredibly unequal global economy forged through the Columbian exchange and then solidified by the Scramble for Africa, this really underscores just how deeply intertwined those historical events are with our present realities, doesn't it?
It really does. It's a powerful reminder, I think, that our understanding of contemporary issues, things like global inequality, systemic racial injustice, complex geopolitical tensions, it's simply incomplete. It's incomplete without acknowledging their deep historical roots in this whole era of discovery and imperialism. The past isn't just history, it's the literal foundation of our present. It often dictates the challenges and maybe even the opportunities we face today. They show how deeply this history lives on. It's not just confined to textbooks. It shapes our collective memory, our national identities, the very landscapes of our cities, and the conversations we're still having about who we are and how we got here.
We have covered so much ground. It seems so clear that the answers, or at least the understanding for today's questions about global inequality, cultural tensions, economic disparities, they're often found by digging deep into this past. So for you, our listener, listening in today, what does all this history mean for how you look at the world, maybe even the news you read tomorrow?
Maybe consider how events that seem so distant, so isolated in time, actually create these long ripple effects across centuries. How they impact everything from global trade routes to cultural identities to political borders. How might understanding these deep historical roots, the good, the bad, and the very ugly, how might that empower us, perhaps, to approach the global challenges we face now with a bit more insight, maybe a bit more empathy? Something to think about.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep digging deeper into the fascinating tapestry of history. We'll see you next time on the podcast, From Opinion to Insight.
Wondering about the future, discovering the silence, truth, and bringing together the story of humans. From opinion to insight, and from source to story, we follow the traces through time and memory, echoing patterns from long ago. Keep exploring, building tomorrow. What drives war? What builds a wall? What makes a rise? What marks a fall? We turn the page, we search the frame to understand what still remains. From opinion to insight, and from source to story, we follow the traces through time and